Welcome everyone to my updated color wheel project. This project is geared towards oil painters and teaches you how to create a wide range of colors with a cool and warm version of each primary color. We will also explore tints, tones, and shades. So for those of you who don't know, tints are when you add white to a color, tones are when you add gray to a color, and shade is when you add black to a color. We're going to be using warm and cool versions of each primary because sometimes it's difficult to find just one. For example, one red that's a perfect primary in oil paint, or one yellow that's a perfect primary. And oftentimes in oil paints, the names, like, you won't find a primary red, primary yellow, primary blue. So I'm going to show you which colors I use for the warm and cool versions. That'll give us the widest range of colors, color mixtures. So I want to talk about what materials I'm using. I've got a canvas panel. I would suggest anything around an 11 by 14 inch or 12 by 12 inch, something like that. A ruler or straight edge, a pencil, some sort of small brush. I'm using a small bright brush, which is like a short flat. But any kind, you'll get a good idea once you start of what size will work for you, depending on what size your canvas is. Here in the video, I'm showing off my colors. I'll get to that in a second, but the other materials that you'll need is a palette knife, some solvent, a paint rag, and your oil colors. Okay, so colors, you can see I'm displaying on the screen. You're going to need a white and a black. The white, I'm using titanium white. The black, I'm using ivory black. And then a warm and cool version of each primary. So for blues, I'm using ultramarine as my warm blue. I'm using phthalo blue as my cool blue. For yellows, I'm using a Hansa for the cool yellow, and I'm using cad yellow for the warm yellow. Here you can see the placement of where the cool and warm versions go on, where they're positioned on the color wheel. You want to mark them on your color wheel first before you start, so you can make sure that you're placing everything correctly. So you can see, for example, the warm blue is closest to the cool red. The warm red is closest to the warm yellow, and the cool yellow is closest to the cool blue, because you'll be mixing those ones together to get your secondary colors, like the greens and the purples and the oranges. So back to color selections, like I said, yellows. For the warm yellow, I'm using cad. I think a cad medium is a good, cadmium medium yellow is a good choice. And then for the reds, I'm using cadmium red light. A cad red medium is fine too. For the cool version, I'm using a quinacridone magenta. I find that one gives me the most vibrant purples. But another good option for a cool red is alizarin crimson, and that's a fairly popular red that people tend to have in their collection of oil paints. So, there's definitely other options out there, but in general, look for a single pigment type of color. For example, some issues I've seen with certain color wheels is when people use a lemon yellow for their cool yellow, and in some brands, a lemon yellow is a good choice, and in other brands, it's not, because sometimes they mix white into it. So you want to make sure there's, these are like pure, vibrant colors that we're using. And you can see I'm starting to lay out the color on my palette. And I'm trying to do it in an organized way so that I don't get mixed up with my color once I place it on the wheel. So I've got white, I've got my cool yellow, and then my warm yellow, and then my cool red, and then my warm red, and then my cool blue, and then my warm blue. And then the other corner, I have my ivory black. You can use other blacks if you want. I think ivory black is a very useful black. It leans a little bit cool, but if you want a super neutral black, I would suggest a Chromatic Black by Gamblin. But some brands will only have a warm or a cool version, like Mars Black would be like a warm black version. But I think Ivory is just a really beautiful, deep black. Anyway, you could see I'm starting to place some color. Notice how I have worked out on the canvas various concentric circles. So I have a few different, options for where to place color. The way that I place it is, first of all, I draw the circles. So I find something that's the right size that I have in my home, such as a plate or a bowl or a cup or even a roll of artist tape. Works as a good template to get a perfect circle. Or if you have a compass tool, even better, you could get really even measurements for placing your circular shapes. But the main thing we want here is 3 rows that we can paint in. Right now I'm painting on the second row and I'm placing just my pure primary colors. And then for the partitions, what I do is I want to end up with 12 pie slices. So what I do is I cut it into fourths, and then each fourth I put 3 sections, and I use a ruler, making sure that the lines intersect the middle to make sure they're really nice and straight, and try your best to get the pie slices at even size. So once you have 12, then you pick 3 pie slices that have equal distance from each other and cut those in half. Those are what I'm working on right now in the video, placing my primary colors. The reason why we're cutting them in half is so that there's room on that primary pie slice to put our warm and cool versions of the colors. So now one thing I will note on this demo is that I switched up my cool and warm blues. I still ended up with a really good range of color. However, if I had positioned them correctly, I probably would have gotten more vibrant greens. So just be aware that the image I showed earlier, where I pointed out, okay, here's a placement for your warm and cool colors. That's the best one to follow if you want really vibrant greens. But I was able to get really beautiful violets. So I still got a pretty good color range. But like I said, there's a science to this in the position of where you put things. So anyway, you could see here I'm just about done with the primary. So I've got a warm and cool version of blue, a warm and cool version of yellow, and a warm and cool version of red. And you'll notice as you're placing the pigments down that some colors, some pigments are naturally more transparent, like this quinacridone magenta that I'm working on right now, and some are naturally more opaque, and some are a little bit in between. That's just the nature of the pigment, because it takes different materials to create different colors. So this is a really good exercise for beginners to really get used to how the color works, how the paint looks, how it works, how there's differences between these different colors in terms of transparency, how to control that, how to get an even application of some of these more difficult pigments. Like ultramarine blue sometimes can be difficult to get a really even application of it. So I think that this is a really, really good introduction to getting the feel for mixing oil paint. Now here you can see I'm working on the greens, which are secondary colors. Primary colors are called primaries, so they're first, right? So you want to lay the primaries in first on the wheel, and then you go to the secondary. So what I did was I mixed yellow and blue, the yellow and blues that are closest to each other on the wheel, and I tried to make a very typical green. So this is also another good exercise for discovering which colors are stronger than others, because typically yellow is a little bit more weak. So you might have to use more yellow than expected with just a little touch of blue to get a typical green. So it's not always like 50% yellow, 50% blue or anything like that. Like when you're mixing, it's not a perfect science like that because like I said, it takes different materials to make different pigments and they all act a little bit differently. So for me, when I start trying to make that typical green, I use a lot of yellow and a little bit of blue, and I can usually get that. And then for the in-between colors, I mix that green that I mixed in with that cool yellow, and I'll do the same thing for that green that's in between blue and green. I'll mix that green that I mixed and that blue to get a green. So notice how when I'm mixing kind of these bigger mixtures of paint, I'm using the palette knife. And then if I have to just mix a really tiny adjustment, I'll use the brush. So that's a really good idea because the palette knife, it keeps things clean and organized on your palette. It is a very quick and efficient way to mix your paints, and it saves you a lot of time. It also saves your brush from getting oversaturated with a color that hasn't been properly mixed yet. So you're kind of saving some wear and tear on your brush. So you'll see throughout the video, whenever I mix a bigger amount, I go for my palette knife. So here I'm just kind of working the paint to get a even application as best as I can. Every section that I do on this color wheel, you'll notice I only do one coat. So I'm not waiting for things to dry and then painting over them. I'm just doing one even coat of each color. So here I'm going to work on the violets in between red and blue. And I start with that really typical in-between violet, which I found the blue is very, very strong. I was using a phthalo blue, and those blues can be really, really strong. You only need a little bit to change the color quickly, and the red was a little weaker. So I had to use a little more red than blue. But what I'm looking for here in between the red and blue is this kind of like gradation or like the slow change, right? So the red turns to a reddish violet, and then we get our typical violet, and then we'll get a bluish violet. So here I'm working on the typical violet. I'm trying to get a really nice even application, and I added a touch of blue to that mixture. Now I'm working on the blue violet. So that blue violet is a tertiary color. So those are the colors that are in between primary and secondary. So we've got primary colors, secondary colors, tertiary colors. Primaries are the blue, red, yellow. Secondaries are the green, orange, violet. Tertiaries are the ones that are in between a primary and secondary. All right, I'm working on the secondary option here for in between yellow and red. I'm going to make orange. And you could see here just a very yellow orange gets placed there. And then I'll have my typical orange next to that. And then I'll have my more reddish orange next to that. Obviously, this video is sped up for, convenience so that it's not too long of a demo. But keep in mind when you do this project, it is going to take time. And especially if you want a really nice, crisp, good quality work here with an even application and staying within the lines and so on and so forth. You want to take your time and make it look nice and make sure that you're placing colors in the right spot. Also make sure, your first try on mixing a color might not be perfect, like for example, if you mix that typical orange and it's too red and you want that more typical orange color, add more yellow. So it's a process of kind of trying things out and getting used to how the paint works. Now I'm working on that outer ring. This outer ring is dedicated to shades. Shades are when you add black to a color. So you're going to notice I'm going to take the mixture of my pure color and I'm going to add a little bit of black for right above it, and then a little bit more black for right above that for the most outer part. So you'll kind of notice here how I'm sort of, because I have the space for it, I'm doing 2 steps. I'm doing a little bit of black and then more black for each color. Really, really important. Make sure after each color is placed, you clean your brush thoroughly with the solvent and the clean rag to really make sure all the pigment's out of your brush before you grab the next color, because that will keep your colors nice and pure. It's especially important for when you're placing the pure colors, which is that first ring that we did. Here we're doing shades, so all the colors are gonna look more neutral because we're adding black, which desaturates the color. But it's interesting to see how you'll get these different versions of these neutrals based on what color you're shading. So here I'm using the red-orange and slowly adding black to it to see what I get. Now, if your outer ring looks solid black, then you probably added too much. We want to see a little bit of the color so we can get this feel for, okay, if we're talking about a painting that has a really dark color, how do we identify which color it's leaning towards, right? Because brown is a very generic word for a neutral color, right? It's not so simple. Some browns lean towards red. Some browns lean towards a cool color like blue or maybe green. So this will really kind of show you how nuanced color is and how many options you have for controlling the color to get really specific results. Okay, we jumped ahead here. Now I focused on a third ring that's in the middle. So next to the primary colors, but inside, you could see I'm almost done with it. I did a whole ring of tints. Now, tints are when you add white to a pure color. So you can see how they're looking like a more soft, light pastel version of those pure colors, right? So I'm finishing that row up so you could see the difference, what happens when you add black to a color versus white to a color. So very important here is that first ring you do, that's all your pure color. You're only using your primary colors to mix those in that first ring that we did. You don't want to add any black and white until you work on the outside rings that have black added and that inside ring that has white added to the color. So what am I doing now? Now I just want to show a little practice here of what does it look like when you add tones to a color. That means adding gray. So what I did was I mixed just black and white to create a typical mid-tone gray, and I'm using that pile of gray to mix with each of my primaries. And I'm doing both my warm and cool versions of each primary. So you can see I started with yellow, and I'm trying to keep the values all the same. Now I'm trying red, so I'll do the warm red right there. And then I'll do the cool red with a little bit of gray added right there. And you'll see how it's the same idea that I was talking about with like browns or these neutral colors, where if you add a lot of black or a lot of white, it sort of desaturates the color. Same thing with gray, because gray is right in between black and white. So it's still considered a neutral or a non-color. But when we mix it with different colors, we can get a variety of these different kinds of neutrals, right? So you can have an example here of what each primary looks like when you add a little bit of gray. So, so this is giving you really good experience with playing around with color, seeing what happens when you add tints, tones, and shades. And it can be an excellent color resource, not only for showing you which colors to mix to get other colors, but also just, it's a very quick reference tool, right? With all those tints, tones, and shades. Here's the finished result. I highly suggest just doing your best with the craftsmanship, trying to get clean edges and even spacing between the pie slices, except for those primaries that are cut in half, of course. But, this project takes time, but if you follow the directions correctly, you can get a really good result, and you can see what your particular color selection will give you in terms of other colors. I think it's a great starting point for people who've never used oil paints before, and it's a great introduction to color theory. So I hope you enjoy, and if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below and I'll try to get back to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.